Tommy was a boy of simple means, but rich in heart. He lived with his mother, Sarah, in a small, modest home at the edge of the city. Their house was old but well kept, with a small garden out front that Sarah tended to in her spare time. Life wasn't easy for them. Sarah worked long hours as a waitress to provide for them, while Tommy, being the only child, spent much of his time alone when he wasn't in school. Despite their challenges, they found happiness in the small things and shared a deep bond that came from years of relying on each other. Every morning, Tommy would walk to school through a park that sat between their home and the school building. The park was a peaceful place, a welcome respite from the bustling city around it. It was filled with towering trees that provided shade and tranquility, flowers that added bursts of color, and well-worn paths that wound through the greenery. But what always caught Tommy's eye was the old wooden bench near the center of the park, under a large oak tree. On this bench, an old homeless man would sit quietly every day, wrapped in layers of tattered clothes, regardless of the weather. The man intrigued Tommy. There was a sadness in his eyes that seemed to reflect years of hardship, but there was also a dignity in the way he sat, as if he were holding on to something that kept him grounded. Tommy couldn't help but feel a connection to the man, a tug of empathy that he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was because, like the man, Tommy knew what it was like to go without, to feel the weight of every penny, and to live with the uncertainty of tomorrow. But there was also something his mother had always instilled in him: kindness. Sarah had taught him that no matter how little they had, there was always something they could give, whether it was a smile, a helping hand, or a kind gesture. One day, as Tommy was getting ready for school, he noticed the bowl of fresh apples on the kitchen counter. His mother had managed to buy them with some extra money she earned from working overtime. He picked one up, admiring its bright red skin and crisp feel. An idea formed in his mind. Without a second thought, he put the apple in his backpack, determined to give it to the old man he saw every day in the park. When Tommy reached the park that morning, the old man was there as usual, sitting quietly on the bench. Tommy approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how the man would react, but the need to help overpowered his fear. As he walked by, he gently placed the apple on the bench beside the man and continued on his way to school without looking back. His steps were lighter that day, a sense of warmth spreading through him as he imagined the man finding the apple. The next morning, Tommy did the same thing, and the morning after that. It became a part of his routine. Each day he would take an apple from the kitchen and leave it on the bench for the old man. He never stayed to see the man's reaction, and the man never acknowledged Tommy's gestures. But that didn't matter to Tommy. The act of giving, knowing that he was helping someone in need, was enough to fill his heart with joy. It was a small thing, but in a world that often felt overwhelming, it was something he could do. Sarah noticed the apples disappearing from the kitchen, but didn't say anything. She had always taught Tommy to be kind and generous, and she trusted him to do what he thought was right. She had a sense that something important was happening, something that went beyond the simple act of giving away fruit. Tommy's heart was big, and she was proud of the young man he was becoming. As the days turned into weeks, Tommy's small gesture became a source of comfort for him. It was something he looked forward to each morning, a moment of peace before the chaos of school and life. The old man on the bench remained silent and mysterious, but there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He seemed to sit a little straighter, his eyes not quite as downcast as before. Though they never spoke, an unspoken bond began to form between the boy and the man, forged through the daily offering of a simple apple. Tommy never knew what the man did with the apples. He didn't know if the man ate them, gave them away, or simply left them there. But what mattered to Tommy was that he was doing something good, something that made him feel connected to the world around him. In a life that was often filled with challenges, this small act of kindness was a bright spot, a reminder that even in the smallest ways, he could make a difference. And so, day after day, Tommy continued his routine, unaware that this small daily act of kindness was setting the stage for something much bigger than he could ever imagine. Tommy's routine had become so ingrained in him that the walk through the park each morning felt almost automatic. The weather had started to cool, with the leaves turning golden and crisp underfoot. As Tommy approached the familiar bench, he instinctively reached into his backpack for the apple he had carefully selected that morning. But when he looked up, he was met with a startling sight. The old man was gone. In his place sat a man Tommy had never seen before. This man was strikingly different from the frail, weathered figure Tommy had grown accustomed to seeing on the bench. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, the dark fabric gleaming in the early morning light. His shoes, polished to perfection, reflected the world around them. Flanking him were two imposing bodyguards, their expressions stern and unreadable as they stood silently, their eyes scanning the surroundings with an air of practiced vigilance. Tommy stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment, he felt a pang of worry for the old man. Where had he gone? Was he all right? The sight of this new figure sitting in the old man's place only deepened Tommy's confusion. The man's presence was so unexpected, so out of place in this familiar setting, that it left Tommy frozen with uncertainty. The man on the bench noticed Tommy's hesitation and looked up, his gaze meeting the boy's. Unlike the bodyguards, his expression was not one of intimidation, but of curiosity. He raised an eyebrow slightly as if intrigued by Tommy's reaction. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the distance between them filled with unspoken questions. Tommy, driven by the habit that had formed over weeks, took a tentative step forward. His fingers tightened around the apple as he approached the bench, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's eyes followed him closely, but he didn't say a word. The bodyguards exchanged glances, but remained still, their attention now fully on Tommy. When Tommy reached the bench, he hesitated for a second longer. The man's presence was imposing, and Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being closely observed. But the thought of abandoning his daily act of kindness never crossed his mind. Gritting his teeth to calm his nerves, he gently placed the apple on the bench, just as he had done every day before. He made a move to turn and walk away, hoping to avoid any confrontation. But as Tommy began to step back, the man on the bench finally spoke. "Wait," the man said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the morning stillness. Tommy froze in his tracks, his back to the man. Slowly, he turned around to face him, his heart racing. The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "You've been leaving these apples here every day, haven't you?" Tommy nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He could feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, making him more nervous than he had ever been. "Why?" the man asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Tommy swallowed hard and finally found his voice. I saw an old man sitting here every day," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "He looked like he needed help, so I started leaving an apple for him every morning." The man's expression remained inscrutable, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, perhaps surprise or maybe admiration. "And you did this? Out of kindness?" he asked, leaning back in his seat as he studied Tommy. Tommy nodded again. "My mom always taught me to be kind to others," he explained, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "Even if we don't have much, there's always something we can give." The man's gaze softened further, and he seemed to be deep in thought, as if weighing Tommy's words carefully. For a moment, the park seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Tommy felt the urge to ask about the old man, to find out if he was all right. But before he could form the words, the man on the bench spoke again. "You don't know who I am, do you?" the man asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. Tommy shook his head, feeling a mix of embarrassment and confusion. The man's presence, the bodyguards, the expensive suit, it all pointed to someone important, someone far beyond the world Tommy knew. The man chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to surprise even him. "My name is Mr. Harrington," he said, introducing himself with a nod. "And the man who used to sit on this bench, he's a friend of mine." Tommy's eyes widened. "Is he okay?" he asked, the concern in his voice genuine and immediate. Mr. Harrington's smile grew a little wider, and he nodded. "He's fine," he reassured Tommy. "He had to leave for a while, but he'll be back." Tommy let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, relief washing over him. He glanced at the apple still sitting on the bench, then back at Mr. Harrington. "I'm glad he's okay," Tommy said softly. "I'll keep leaving the apples for him." Mr. Harrington studied the boy for a long moment, his eyes filled with something Tommy couldn't quite place, something deeper than mere curiosity. "You're a good boy," Mr. Harrington said at last, his voice tinged with something that sounded almost like pride. "Your mother raised you well." Tommy smiled shyly, the praise catching him off guard. "Thank you, sir," he replied, not sure what else to say. Mr. Harrington reached out and picked up the apple, turning it over in his hands as if it were something precious. "You know," he began thoughtfully, "kindness like yours is rare. It's something that should be rewarded." Tommy blinked in surprise, unsure of what Mr. Harrington meant. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said honestly. "I just wanted to help." Mr. Harrington looked at Tommy with newfound respect, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "That's what makes it so special," he said softly. "You gave without expecting anything in return. That's true generosity." Tommy didn't know how to respond. He had never thought of his actions as anything extraordinary, just something small he could do to make someone else's day a little better. But hearing Mr. Harrington's words, he felt a sense of pride and happiness swell in his chest. Mr. Harrington stood up, towering over Tommy, but with a gentleness in his demeanor that put the boy at ease. He handed the apple back to Tommy, a small, thoughtful smile on his face. "Thank you for the apple," he said, his tone sincere, "and for reminding me that there are still good people in this world." Tommy took the apple, his heart racing with a mix of emotions. He couldn't quite grasp what had just happened, but he knew it was something important, something he would remember for a long time. As Mr. Harrington turned to leave, his bodyguards falling into step beside him, he paused and looked back at Tommy. "Take care, young man," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality, "and keep being kind." With that, Mr. Harrington walked away, leaving Tommy standing by the bench, the apple in his hand and a sense of wonder in his heart. The park once again was quiet, but the encounter had left an indelible mark on Tommy's soul. As Tommy watched Mr. Harrington disappear down the path, he couldn't help but feel that something had changed, something profound and meaningful. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew that this moment, this unexpected encounter, was only the beginning of something much bigger. The day after their encounter, Tommy couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harrington. The man's words had left a lasting impression on him, and as he walked to the park the next morning, he found himself filled with a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. He wondered if Mr. Harrington would be there again, or if the old man might have returned to the bench. Clutching the apple in his hand, he made his way to the spot that had become so familiar to him. As Tommy approached the bench, his heart skipped a beat. Mr. Harrington was there, alone this time, sitting quietly with his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were closed as if he were deep in thought, and for a moment, Tommy hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt. But before he could decide, Mr. Harrington opened his eyes and smiled warmly at the boy. "Good morning, Tommy," he said in a gentle tone that instantly put the boy at ease. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," Tommy replied, returning the smile as he walked up to the bench. The two of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the early morning sun casting a soft glow over the park. Finally, Mr. Harrington gestured for Tommy to sit beside him, and the boy did so, placing the apple on the bench as he had done so many times before. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation yesterday," Mr. Harrington began, his voice thoughtful. "There's something I need to tell you, something I think you deserve to know." Tommy looked up at him, intrigued. The seriousness in Mr. Harrington's tone made him realize that whatever he was about to hear would be important, something that could change his understanding of everything that had happened over the past weeks. Mr. Harrington sighed softly, a hint of weariness in his expression. "Tommy, there's something you don't know about me," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "The man who used to sit on this bench, the one you've been leaving apples for every day, that man was me." Tommy blinked in confusion, not quite grasping what Mr. Harrington was saying. "But you're not old and you don't look like him," he said, his brow furrowed. Mr. Harrington smiled sadly. "Appearances can be deceiving, Tommy," he said. "You see, I wasn't always the man you see now. For a long time, I lived a different life, a life where I chose to walk away from all the comforts of wealth and live as a vagrant. I did it because I wanted to understand the struggles of those less fortunate. I wanted to see the world through their eyes, to experience what they experience every day." Tommy's eyes widened as the realization began to sink in. You You were pretending to be homeless? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. In a way, yes, Mr. Harrington admitted. But it wasn't just pretending. I gave up everything. My home, my possessions, my identity. I wanted to know what it felt like to have nothing, to be invisible to the world. And for a while, I lived that life, just as so many others do. I learned a great deal about human nature, about how people treat those who they see as beneath them. He paused, his gaze distant, as if recalling painful memories. But over time, I began to lose hope. The world can be a cruel place, Tommy. People can be indifferent, even hostile, to those who have nothing. I started to wonder if there was any kindness left in the world, if anyone would care about a man who had fallen so low. Tommy listened intently, his heart aching at the thought of Mr. Harrington, this wealthy, powerful man, experiencing the harsh realities of life on the streets. The idea that someone could willingly choose such a life was beyond his understanding, but he could see the sincerity in Mr. Harrington's eyes, the depth of the pain he had endured. And then, Mr. Harrington continued, his voice softening, one day, as I sat on this very bench, I saw you, a young boy with a kind heart who didn't look away when he saw someone in need. You didn't judge me, you didn't ignore me. You simply offered what you had, a simple apple, every day. It may seem like a small gesture, but to me, it was everything. It was a reminder that there is still goodness in the world, that not everyone has lost their compassion. Tommy felt a lump form in his throat as he realized the impact his actions had on Mr. Harrington. He had never thought of his daily routine as anything extraordinary, just a way to show a bit of kindness to someone who seemed to need it. But hearing Mr. Harrington's words, he understood just how much it had meant. I couldn't believe that someone would be so kind, especially to someone like me, Mr. Harrington said, his voice filled with emotion. It restored my faith, Tommy. Your simple act of kindness made me believe in humanity again, and for that, I am forever grateful. Tommy's eyes welled up with tears, and he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to cry in front of Mr. Harrington. But the man saw the boy's struggle and reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. You don't have to be embarrassed, Tommy, Mr. Harrington said gently. You've done something truly remarkable. You've shown me that there is hope, that there are still people in this world who care about others, even when they have nothing to gain. Tommy looked up at Mr. Harrington, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I just wanted to help, he said, his voice trembling slightly. And you did, Mr. Harrington said with a warm smile. More than you know. You helped me find my way back to who I really am. You reminded me of the importance of kindness, of compassion. And for that, I wanted to thank you in person. Tommy felt a surge of pride and happiness at Mr. Harrington's words. He had never expected anything in return for his actions, but knowing that he had made such a difference in someone's life filled him with a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. Mr. Harrington reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He handed it to Tommy, who took it with a curious expression. This, Mr. Harrington explained, is a journal I kept during my time on the streets. It contains my thoughts, my experiences, and everything I learned along the way. I want you to have it, as a reminder of the impact you've had on my life, and as a testament to the power of kindness. Tommy opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with neat, handwritten entries. He could see the pain and struggle in the words, but also the hope that had been rekindled through his simple acts of generosity. It was a gift more valuable than anything he could have imagined. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll treasure this. Mr. Harrington smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and pride. You're a remarkable young man, Tommy, and I have no doubt that you'll continue to make a difference in the lives of others, just as you've made a difference in mine. Tommy nodded, a sense of determination swelling within him. He had always wanted to help others, but now he understood just how powerful even the smallest acts of kindness could be. He made a silent promise to himself to continue being the person his mother had taught him to be. Someone who cared, someone who gave without expecting anything in return. As they sat together on the bench, the morning sun rising higher in the sky, Tommy felt a deep connection with Mr. Harrington. It was a bond forged not by wealth or status, but by something far more meaningful: compassion, empathy, and the shared understanding of what it meant to give and receive kindness. In that moment, Tommy realized that his life had changed, just as Mr. Harrington's had. The boy who once left an apple on a bench out of simple kindness had now become part of a story much larger than himself, a story that had touched the heart of a man who had once lost his way, but who had now found it again, thanks to the selfless actions of a young boy. And as they sat together, two unlikely friends brought together by fate and the power of a single apple, Tommy knew that this was only the beginning of something wonderful, a new chapter in both their lives, filled with hope, kindness, and the promise of a brighter future. The revelation of Mr. Harrington's true identity and the bond that formed between him and Tommy marked a turning point in both of their lives. But the story of their connection was far from over. It was about to evolve into something even more profound. The day after Mr. Harrington revealed himself to Tommy, they met again on the same bench in the park. This time, Mr. Harrington was not alone. He had brought a few of his trusted associates, dressed casually to blend in with the park's serene atmosphere. As Tommy approached with his usual apple in hand, he noticed the group and hesitated for a moment. But when he saw Mr. Harrington's warm smile, he felt reassured and continued his approach. "Good morning, Tommy," Mr. Harrington greeted, rising from the bench to meet the boy. His tone was light, but there was an underlying seriousness in his expression that made Tommy wonder what was going on. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," Tommy replied, glancing at the other men standing nearby. They were watching him with interest, but there was no hostility in their gaze, only curiosity and respect. Mr. Harrington noticed Tommy's apprehension and quickly explained, "These are some of my associates, Tommy. They're here because we've been discussing something important, something that involves you." Tommy's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? What do you mean?" Mr. Harrington gestured for Tommy to sit on the bench, and once they were both seated, he began to speak with a calm but earnest tone. "Tommy, yesterday you showed me a kindness that I will never forget. Your act of leaving an apple for me every day, even when you didn't know who I was, touched me deeply. It made me realize that there is still goodness in the world, and that people like you are the reason why hope still exists." Tommy felt a warmth spread through his chest at Mr. Harrington's words. He had never considered his actions to be anything extraordinary, but hearing Mr. Harrington speak made him feel proud of what he had done. "Because of you," Mr. Harrington continued, "I've decided to make some changes in my life. I want to give back to the community, to help those who are struggling, just as you helped me. And I want to do it in your name, as a way of honoring the kindness you've shown." Tommy was stunned. The idea that someone as important as Mr. Harrington wanted to do something so meaningful because of him was overwhelming. But before he could respond, Mr. Harrington went on, his voice filled with sincerity. "I would like to offer my support to you and your mother, Tommy," he said gently. "I know that life hasn't been easy for you, and I want to make sure that you both have everything you need. Whether it's financial support, education, or anything else, I'm here to help." Tommy's heart swelled with gratitude, but at the same time, he felt a pang of uncertainty. His mother had always taught him to be kind to others, without expecting anything in return, and the idea of accepting such a generous offer made him feel conflicted. He looked down at his hands, thinking about what his mother would say. After a moment of silence, Tommy looked up at Mr. Harrington, his voice steady but soft. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I really appreciate what you're offering, but my mom always taught me that we should help others because it's the right thing to do, not because we want something in return. I don't want to take anything from you, just because I was kind." Mr. Harrington was taken aback by the boy's response, but as he processed Tommy's words, a deep respect for the boy grew within him. Here was a child, young and humble, who understood a lesson that many adults struggled to grasp. The purity of Tommy's heart and the strength of his character were qualities that Mr. Harrington admired greatly. He nodded slowly, his expression one of admiration. "Your mother has raised a remarkable young man, Tommy," he said with a smile. "I understand and respect your decision, but if you won't allow me to help you directly, then I would like to do something else, something that will benefit others, just as you've been doing." Tommy looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Mr. Harrington's eyes sparkled with a renewed sense of purpose. I've decided to become a benefactor to this park and the surrounding community. I want to use my resources to improve the conditions for those who are struggling, just like the man you thought you were helping all this time. We'll start with the park, cleaning it up, adding new benches, playground equipment, and even a small community garden. But it won't stop there. I'll also be providing support to local shelters, food banks, and educational programs. Tommy's eyes widened as he imagined the impact of Mr. Harrington's plans. The park, which had always been a simple, quiet place, would become a hub of activity and joy, a place where people could gather, find support, and feel a sense of community. The thought of it filled him with excitement and pride. "But there's one condition," Mr. Harrington added, his tone light but firm. "I want to do this in your name, Tommy. I want everyone to know that these changes are happening because of you, because of the kindness you showed to someone you thought was in need." Tommy was speechless. The idea of having his name associated with such a project was beyond anything he had ever imagined. But as he looked into Mr. Harrington's eyes, he saw the sincerity and determination there, and he knew that this was something he couldn't refuse. "Okay," Tommy said finally, a smile spreading across his face. "But only if it helps other people. That's what's most important." Mr. Harrington grinned, his heart swelling with pride for the young boy sitting beside him. "It will, Tommy. I promise you that." Over the next few weeks, the transformation of the park began. Workers arrived to clean and restore the area, planting new trees and flowers, installing fresh benches and playground equipment, and setting up the community garden that Mr. Harrington had promised. The local community was abuzz with excitement as they watched their beloved park come to life in a way they had never seen before. But the changes didn't stop there. With Mr. Harrington's support, local shelters received much-needed funding to expand their services. Food banks were stocked with supplies to feed more families, and educational programs were established to help children and adults alike improve their skills and find new opportunities. Throughout it all, Tommy remained a central figure in the project. He visited the park every day, just as he had always done, but now he did so with a sense of purpose and pride. He watched as the community came together to enjoy the new facilities, children laughing on the playground, families tending to the garden, and people of all ages finding solace and support in the revitalized space. One day, as Tommy sat on the same bench where it had all begun, Mr. Harrington joined him once again. The park was bustling with activity, filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Mr. Harrington said, looking around with satisfaction. "All of this because of one boy's kindness." Tommy smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "It wasn't just me," he said modestly. "You made all of this happen." Mr. Harrington shook his head. "No, Tommy, you were the spark that lit the fire. You reminded me of what really matters in life: kindness, compassion, and the willingness to help others. Without you, none of this would have happened." Tommy looked out at the park, watching as a group of children played on the swings, their laughter echoing through the air. He felt a warmth in his chest, knowing that his small act of kindness had grown into something so much bigger than he had ever imagined. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Tommy and Mr. Harrington sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had started as strangers, one a wealthy businessman searching for meaning, the other a young boy with a heart full of kindness. But now they were connected by a bond that transcended wealth, status, or age. In that moment, Tommy realized that his mother had been right all along. Kindness was the most powerful force in the world, capable of changing lives, mending hearts, and bringing people together in ways that nothing else could. And as he sat beside Mr. Harrington, watching the park fill with life and laughter, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with hope, generosity, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest act of kindness could make the world a better place. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.